if somebody has a lesion in their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or if you transiently inactivate it with a technology, a non-invasive technology like transcranial magnetic stimulation, they can now just put a magnet on outside the skull and quiet that area of the brain transiently. In animals or humans, what you find is that person or human becomes incredibly accurate at any motor task. So for instance, if I were to give you a shooter game where you're supposed to shoot targets and you're shooting targets, you'll have some hits and some misses, like anybody. If I inactivate your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, your accuracy goes through the roof. It's near 100%. But the one thing you can't do is decide whether or not you're shooting an enemy or a friend. So you can no longer establish rules. You just become very good at execution of the motor behavior. Similarly, in an animal or person without a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex,
you see a trade-off there, right, between specificity and flexibility.
That's right. And so we see this theme over and over again, where as a purely, sensory motor response machine, the prefrontal cortex isn't even necessary. In fact, if you get rid of it entirely, people become like machines. If I click over here, somebody has no prefrontal cortex, basically everything becomes a stimulus. A puppy, everything's a stimulus. I used to have a bulldog. When he was a puppy, you had to worry about leaving cords out and everything went into his mouth. By the time he was, a year old, in part because he was a bulldog, you just kind of lay there. Like you could put a toy in front of him and he wasn't into playing and just leave it alone. A baby, everything's a stimulus. Many adults become infant-like in their responses, right? When anxiety is high. In fact, I have a friend who's a psychologist. Tell me if you agree with this statement or not, that anxiety makes children of us all. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly has been my experience that when feeling anxious, I don't struggle with chronic anxiety, but I certainly have felt anxiety.
Well, it simplifies us. I mean, all these underlying emotions and motivational states, these primordial instincts, are simplification mechanisms. And so if we're unable to compute a complex and sophisticated pathway forward that takes multiple variables into account simultaneously, we can't just do nothing. We're going to default to a more primordial and direct state. And then you might say the whole panoply of emotions and motivations lies there at the weight for us to grip our behavior if we're paralyzed by inability to choose between multiple options. And so we do, to the degree that we're simplified by an emotion, then we're reduced to something more approximating an infantile state. If you watch 2-year-olds, and 2-year-olds are particularly interesting in this regard, they basically just cycle through innate motivational states. It makes them really interesting to be around because when they're interested in something, they're 100% interested in it. And then when they're angry, they're 100% angry. And if they're anxious, they're 100% anxious. And tired, they just instantly fall into a coma, and they just cycle through these with no overarching centralized integration. And it's partly because they likely don't really manifest any integrating prefrontal cortical capacity until they hit about 3, where they can start to engage in joint play states with other children, right? And then they can exercise, then they can modulate their underlying emotions in accordance with an abstract representation or goal, sometimes that's jointly shared. That's part of developing sophistication. It's also why the idea that identity is subjectively defined is absolutely preposterous. It's like, it's subjectively defined for 2-year-olds, but it's not subjectively defined for anyone who's sophisticated enough to negotiate with someone else. And so tell me what you think about this. My understanding of the prefrontal cortex is that over the course of evolutionary time, it grew out of the frontal cortex and that out of the motor cortex more specifically. And so the best way to think about what the prefrontal cortex does in some sense is that it generates potential abstract patterns of action. It generates them in abstraction so that they can be assessed before they're implemented. And so it's like it's generating potential future selves.
That's exactly right.
That's okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
and I'm glad you stated it, not I, because you stated it far more clearly and succinctly than I've heard it stated before. It's as if it's running plays. I'm using a sports analogy. It's running plays and thinking about potential outcomes. I'm not a chess player, although Lex Friedman's podcast and Lex Friedman are convincing me that perhaps I should learn because there's a lot of discussion about chess nowadays. And there's a lot of thinking, as I understand, about potential outcomes. How many moves can you anticipate if this, then that? It's sort of if this, then that type of thinking. And if you think about its connectivity, it's in a beautiful position based on its access to priors through the hippocampus, so memory. It can take into account current state, bodily state. It can access information, for instance, about, do I have the energy? Do I have the resources to undergo a particular pattern of response? And that's through the insula and the ACC. And then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in this way of also being able to control the body, of being able to calm the body, this is a very unique pathway, because typically we think of the heart rate as going up if we're excited or scared, and heart rate going down if we're calm. But really the default of the neural inputs to the heart and to the breathing systems, et cetera, are to be very activated. And then the brain provides a suppressive or kind of a braking on that entire system. The vagus nerve.
Right. So it's a default on system.
It's a default on system. And the vagus nerve, which of course is a massive nerve pathway. Again, it makes it sound like one little nerve, but it's this huge superhighway of connections between brain and body, is classified in medical school as a parasympathetic pathway, meaning of the calming system.